Ms. Donele Wilkins. Many of you know Donele is one of the leading lights in the environmental justice movement. She's also a leading light in the state of Michigan as a leading and singular voice in the environmental justice movement. She is the founding executive director of Detroit's Working for Environmental Justice. She has recently launched the Greendoor initiative here in Detroit. And so what we have for you this afternoon is a really special program. Donele being the youngest of the trio on the stage. She's the baby that was raised up by these two extraordinary individuals, Dr. Bunyan Bryant and Ms. Boggs, two of the leaders of the environmental, civil rights, social justice movement in Michigan and across the country. Donele.
For your patience, because it's going to be a difficult task for me to get through this without shedding a few tears. Because of the impact that these two people have had on my life and my career. And I can honestly say, had it not been for either one of them, I would not be on this stage today. So I want to publicly thank both Bunyan and Grace for their love, their leadership, their vision, and even their confidence in me in being a part of this important movement. Thank you, and I love you. So I will begin by providing you some information about their backgrounds, which really does not mean that their life has been such an example of the things that I'm going to share with you. And then we'll let them talk and learn from them. First, Dr. Bunyan Bryant spent 40 years on the faculty of the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and the Environment, and I believe was the first African American in that department to serve in that capacity. So he made history just walking into the doors of the University of Michigan. Bryant, PhD, is the director of the Environmental Justice Initiative. He launched that, and an Arthur F. Thurno, professor at the University of Michigan, Natural Resources and Environment, where he taught environmental justice. Dr. Bryant has provided leadership in global climate change and environmental justice. He believes that no other issue threatens developing countries and low-income people of color communities in developed nations more than global climate change. Dr. Bryant is currently, or he has written, a textbook on environmental advocacy, working for economic and environmental justice. He and Professor Paul Mohai edited the book Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards, A Time for Discourse, which has been used widely by lawyers, students, and advocates. Professor Bryant has also edited the book Environmental Justice Issues, Policies, and Solutions. He has written numerous articles for peer-reviewed journals. In fact, he has written a couple new books that Grace wants to have the privilege of sharing with you, so I will not take that from her. She won't let me anyway. And wonderful Grace Boggs. People are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. We need a vision that recognizes that we are at one of the great turning points in human history, when the survival of our planet and the restoration of our humanity require a great sea change in our ecological, economic, political, and spiritual values, both from Grace Boggs. A prominent activist her entire adult life. Grace Lee was born in Rhode Island in 1915. Do the math, y'all. The daughter of Chinese immigrants. She studied at Barnard College and Bryn-Mawr, received her PhD in 1940. Her studies in philosophy and the writings of Marx, Hegel, and Nietzsche led not to a life in academia, teaching others to question themselves and those in power, but rather to a lifetime of social activism and collaboration with others. Grace has lived in many places, but she came to Detroit. She and her wonderful husband spent many years in the civil rights, James Boggs, spent many years in the civil rights movement here in the city of Detroit. Grace Boggs embraces a philosophy of constant questioning, not just of who we are as individuals, but of how we relate to those in our community and country, to those in other countries, and to the local and global environment. Now I'm going to step away from this formal thing and just say, Detroiters working for environmental justice and the environmental justice movement in the state of Michigan would not have happened without the two of them. Dr. Bunyan Bryant tapped me on the shoulders as a young person and believed that I had something to contribute to the movement that was emerging in the early 1990s. And because of that, gave me a purpose in life when I attended the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that he spearheaded. And he introduced me to Grace Lee Boggs. When we returned from that historic event and decided that it was time to make a change in our community, he said, you need to know Grace Lee Boggs. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. Because if you've ever understood the term iron, what is the word? Sharpens iron, thank you. Grace was my iron. And Grace celebrated, she was one of the first to celebrate leadership where it came to me. It pushed me into that level that I did not imagine I could be in. And I want to thank you for that. Now, it is time to have this wonderful conversation between the two of you that everyone is waiting for. And I believe Grace is going to start with you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Donele, and thank you, Planning Committee, for having organized this opportunity for me to talk about missionary organizing. Because that's what I want to talk about. I want, how am I doing? Can you hear me? I first met Bunyan about 25 years ago. It was the early 90s, late 80s. And we were at a turning point. We didn't know it, but we were at a turning point which has now come to a sort of climax. And Bunyan did a series of things which I want to talk about because they are still necessary. And most people don't know what they are, but I think if I talk about them, you will see that they are things you need to be doing in this next period. As dictators look like Mubarak and Gaddafi are overthrown, and as elected officials like Obama and Bola become dysfunctional. There are things we have to do, and things that Bunyan started doing in a movement that is environmental, but is also very comprehensive in terms of where we are in the world today. Let me give you an example. In 1991, he was one of the conveners of the first People of Color Environmental Summit, which produced the 17 principles of environmental justice. I don't know how many of you know those principles. But I especially call your attention to principle number 7, which calls for democratic decision-making by the people at every point. And principle number 17, which talks about how we relate to the earth. These are principles which I think are needed by the people in the Arab Spring, in countries all over the world who are trying to create new constitutions, having overthrown the old leadership. So I'm going to, when we talk about Bunyan, don't talk only about the United States, and don't only talk about the environment. Talk about where the world is at this moment, and the kind of leadership they need, and the kind of leadership. In 1992, I was a member of a workshop There were about 10 of us. And after we introduced ourselves, to our amazement, he asked us to write a story of what the world would be like 40 years from now. I had not expected it. My mind went completely blank. But before long, I began talking about how young people and the schools would be changed, and how young people would become part of the solution instead of the problem. And subsequently, our stories were published in this article, Rehearsing the Future. And we brought some copies of these, so I hope you folks will read it. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. That was 20 years ago. And what Bunyan was saying was the collapse of the existing society was providing opportunities for us to create the future. And we haven't thought enough about the future. And that's what I want you to do. How do we think about the future? Bunyan is the author of this marvelous book called The Future, Images from the 21st Century. Think about the future. How many of you think about the future? How many of you think of yourself as creating a new society from the ground up? Because it can't be done from Washington. How can we do that? Begin talking about creating sort of images of what a new society would be like. What would our education be like? How would we grow our food? How would we relate to one another? How would we deal with questions of crime and insecurity? I mean, these are the questions that we're going to have to deal with because the government is going to deal with them. And these are questions that people all over the world are faced with. And we have to begin thinking that way. And Bunyan is that kind of visionary thinker. And I want you to think about that because what happened I remember that in 1994, President Clinton decided to say that all the departments of the federal government had to comply with the principles of environmental justice. And Bunyan and Jerry Pochi organized a participation by all of us in a conference here in Washington, D.C. And he created small groups by which we would evaluate what was going on. And I was the leader of one small group, and we said the people from the agencies were talking too damn much. The next morning, as Liz Browner was reading her speech, we broke out in a civil rights song. And we forced her to tear up the speech and open the mic for everybody to talk. She even cried. How many people were there? Do you remember that? That's the kind of visionary organizing we need to be doing. And Bunyan has been wonderful at that. And it's the sort of thing we need to be doing more and more. It's not difficult to do, but we need to know how it's done, how you are able to get people thinking in a way for themselves, and how we do that. Now, Bunyan's latest book is based on a conference that he organized in 2002. And this is the cover of the book. And which he says that the crisis is not just a crisis of the ecology, but it's a crisis of how we organize, because people who have a lot of education think they're the ones who know what's going on. And they don't know how to relate to people in the community. So it's a question of epistemology of what we do with our heads. And I want us to think about that, because it's the kind of visionary organizing that each of us can do once we understand how critical it is that we do it, and that we don't depend on people in the White House or people in the university to do all this sort of thing. And Bryant has been a master of that, and I've learned so much from him.
Thank you for this picture. I do have trouble projecting my voice, so if you can't hear me, let me know. And you hear me? Yes. I want to do something a little different.